In the sprawling urban landscape of Washington, D.C., a city of monuments and power, countless stories unfold every day. Some are tales of ambition and success, while others are stories of struggle, hidden in plain sight. It was within this complex, often indifferent metropolis that an 8-year-old girl, a child with a bright smile and a future yet to be written, simply ceased to be seen. She did not vanish from a busy playground under the afternoon sun, nor was she snatched from a quiet street on her way home from school. Her disappearance was a slow, creeping void that grew unnoticed for weeks, a quiet erasure that would eventually trigger a frantic city-wide search and a mystery that endures to this day. The case of Relisha Rudd is not a typical tale of a child gone missing. It is a story woven into the very fabric of systemic failure, poverty, and vulnerability. Her life was lived on the margins, within the walls of a city-run shelter meant to provide safety for the homeless. Instead, it became the last place she was known to have a stable home before she disappeared into a confusing timeline of excused absences and questionable circumstances. The story begins in early 2014, a time when Relisha Rudd should have been in her second-grade classroom, learning to read and write, making friends, and dreaming of what she might become. Instead, a series of excused absences, later found to be fraudulent, kept her away from the one place where her absence might have been immediately noticed. School officials were told she was sick, under the care of a Dr. Tatum, a name that would later become central to the entire investigation. These reassurances, provided by a man who had befriended Relisha's family, were enough to keep the system at bay for a crucial period. By the time her school officially reported her missing to Child Protective Services on March 19, 2014, Relisha had not been independently verified as safe for weeks. The last confirmed sighting of her was on March 1st, leaving an 18-day gap filled with uncertainty and dread. The investigation that followed was massive and unrelenting. The Metropolitan Police Department, along with the FBI, deployed hundreds of officers, search and rescue teams, and canine units. They meticulously combed through Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, a vast and dense 700-acre expanse of woods and marshland in northeast D.C. This location became a focal point after investigators connected it to the movements of their sole person of interest, Khalil Tatum, a janitor who worked at the D.C. General Family Shelter where Relisha and her family lived. The search was a grueling and desperate effort, but despite their exhaustive work, they found no trace of the little girl. Today, more than a decade has passed. An entire childhood has gone by since Relisha Rudd was last seen. For investigators, the case remains open and active, a persistent reminder of a puzzle they have been unable to solve. The question that echoed through the streets of Washington, D.C. in 2014 remains just as loud today. Where is Relisha Rudd? The mystery endures, a decade-long silence that refuses to be broken. Before she became a face on a missing poster, a name synonymous with a city's failure, Relisha Rudd was simply a little girl. She was 8 years old, a second grader with deep brown eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Born into a world of profound instability, Relisha's childhood was defined by the harsh realities of poverty and homelessness in the nation's capital. Her life was a constant series of movements, a nomadic existence that saw her and her family shuttling between the homes of relatives and the impersonal, often chaotic environment of public shelters. This was the landscape of her youth, a stark contrast to the postcard image of Washington, D.C., a world far removed from the marbled halls of power that stood just miles away from where she slept. The final stop on her family's journey through the city's shelter system was the D.C. General Hospital complex. Once a sprawling public hospital by 2014, its largest building had been converted into a makeshift family shelter, housing hundreds of families in former hospital rooms. It was a place of last resort, notorious for its dilapidated conditions, overcrowding, and the pervasive sense of despair that hung in the air. This was the environment where Relisha spent her final known months. It was a setting ripe for exploitation, where the lines between resident and staff, between protector and predator, could become dangerously blurred. It was here, within these walls, that Relisha's path would cross with a janitor, a man who seemed to offer kindness and gifts, but would ultimately become the central figure in the mystery of her vanishing. The carefully constructed illusion of Relisha's well-being finally began to crumble on March 13, 2014. A counselor from Payne Elementary made a visit to the DC General Shelter. It was during this conversation that the first jarring crack in the narrative appeared. When the counselor mentioned Relisha's ongoing medical treatment, her mother seemed confused. On March 19, 2014, officials from Payne Elementary formally contacted the DC Child and Family Services Agency, CFSA. They reported Relisha as a missing child. This official report was the tripwire. When they could not locate the child, they called the police. That same day, March 19th, the Metropolitan Police Department was officially notified. What had started as a school attendance issue had now exploded into a full-blown missing person case. Their first priority, locate Khalil Tatum. But when they went to look for him, they discovered that he too was gone. The investigation was no longer just a search for a missing child. It was now a manhunt for the only person of interest, a desperate race against a clock that had been ticking for far too long. On March 20th, 2014, the Metropolitan Police Department issued an Amber Alert for Relisha Rudd. A city that had been oblivious was suddenly placed on high alert. As the manhunt for Tatum intensified, the investigation took a much darker turn. Police in Prince George's County were called to a room at an Oxon Hill Red Roof Inn. Inside the room, they discovered the body of a woman, identified as Andrea Tatum, Khalil Tatum's wife. She had died from a single gunshot wound. The investigation's focus shifted to a specific area, Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, where investigators believed he had hidden the evidence of his crimes. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Divers were sent into the murky waters. Despite the monumental effort, the park yielded nothing. No grave, no clothing, no trace of the little girl. On March 31st, police were called to Kenilworth Park once again, a groundskeeper who had discovered a body in a small shed. The body was identified as Khalil Tatum. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The man who held all the answers had taken that secret to his grave. In the years since Relisha's disappearance, investigators have been left with a case defined not by what they have, but by what they don't. There was no DNA, no hair, no fibers, no fingerprints. This absence of evidence is one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. The passage of time is now the greatest adversary. More than a decade has passed since Relisha was last seen. The most urgent and heartbreaking of these is also the simplest. Where is she? How did a child vanish from a city-run shelter, a place meant to be a sanctuary? Relisha's story exposed deep cracks in the social safety net. More than a decade later, she should be a young woman. Instead, her name is a reminder of a promise unfulfilled and a question unanswered. The investigation remains open. Somebody, somewhere, may still hold a piece of information that could finally break the silence. Until that day comes, the question will continue to echo. Where is Relisha?